Hello, welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. My guest today is the most interesting man who's ever crossed the channel, and his name is Richard Moody. And Richard Moody was first a fighter pilot who later on became a peace activist. And if you think the two don't match, you'll find out from Richard how he did this. He's written a book about his life and his work, and it's called Flying Through Life, From Fighter Pilot to Peace Activist. And what he's done, and he will tell us about it, he was a fighter pilot. He was a naval officer in the Royal Navy in England. He was with the U.S. Navy in the Vietnamese era, and he became an international airline pilot. But along the way, he discovered that he didn't want to be involved in the destruction of people and society. He wanted to help. And that's when he turned himself around. So this is his journey. And Richard, why don't you tell us what happened? How did you become a peace activist from a fighter pilot?
Well, thank you very much, Joan. It was a long transition because when you're in the Navy, whether it be the US Navy or the Royal Navy, particularly flying off a carrier, as I did 627 landings to my name, you're all very much involved. Comradeship is at the fore. You're a squadron together. And of course, you're obeying orders and you're doing your job to the best of your ability, and you don't really think about it all. But as I got older, I started to question it. And I think the turning point was probably when I was amazingly asked to join the Royal Naval Reserve Air Branch as a fighter pilot, flying a single-seat Hawker Hunter fighter in a NATO exercise every year for a month in Scandinavia, operating out of Denmark. Even though I was living in the United States. And it just seemed to me such an incredible boondoggle that I was paid to do this. I was a lieutenant commander, which was the rank I ended up as when I resigned from the Navy. And that's really started me thinking about it. And then I started really looking into peace and Quakerism. And without getting into too much detail right now, I was fortunate to meet the Reverend Bob Moore of the Coalition for Peace Action. And I joined the Coalition for Peace Action and have been a member for over 20 years. And of course, events such as what I call the illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq really put me over the top. So that really is in short words, the transition, but it involved many other people giving me advice and helping me along the way. Thank you, Joan.
Well, thank you for wanting to make peace instead of war. How can you share with us now that finding yourself as a peace activist, what do you do and what do you think others should do to support peace in our world?
Yes, well, it involves a lot of actions and a lot of forethought, I think. But the first thing I did when I really got involved into the peace movement was trying to help people, not necessarily involved with war, but to get people to understand about the horrors of war and the crimes against humanity, which unfortunately have been committed so many times. And I hate to say it, and I am a US citizen as well as a British citizen, but the US has not won one war since World War II, when you think about it or look at it. All we've done is destroyed societies. And so part of my mission is to help people understand that, but also to help people who perhaps have suffered because of our foreign policy actions. And I've spent a lot of time with families I've sponsored in El Salvador. I've twice been there, in Nicaragua, Bolivia, not that we've done too much nastiness in Bolivia, but I also worked in a Syrian refugee camp in Greece not long ago as a volunteer. And of course, we are still heavily involved in Syria. I think we've got about 4,000 troops there to this day. And so that is all part of what I've been trying to do, is not only lecture and talk about peace and Quakerism, and I became a Quaker about 20 years ago because peace is at the forefront of the Quaker faith, but also trying to get people to understand that we're achieving absolutely nothing by our death and destruction. And of course, it's morally very wrong. And as Winston Churchill said, war is not the answer. Diplomacy before war. And that what really worries me, that there is not enough diplomacy going on in our operations abroad. We're just killing people and not making any effort to sit down and talk about peace. So that really is the journey I've taken. And I find it extremely rewarding. Most people are very receptive, but funnily enough, the people who aren't receptive are my fellow pilots in the Royal Navy, not so much the US Navy. And I think that's because we have the most terrible problem in the US with suicide amongst veterans. It's running at about 14 a day. A friend of mine is just being diagnosed with PTSD, who was on many bombing runs of Hanoi, and it's come home to roost much later. A friend of mine is suffering from Agent Orange, very near death, because of being exposed to Agent Orange in the jungles of Vietnam when he was a forward air controller. And funny enough, the Royal Navy folks are not so keen. And I think it's because the British Navy has not really been involved in any major conflicts since the Korean War. It is involved to a smaller degree in some of the conflicts we're involved in, but it hasn't affected people of my age because they haven't really been involved in any warfare themselves. I mean, I was never in any major warfare. I wasn't allowed to drop bombs on Vietnam, thank goodness, because I was not an American citizen, and Britain was not meant to be involved in the war, although we were clandestinely. But I was involved in a few minor skirmishes and conflicts, one called the Indonesian Confrontation, one called the Bara Patrol. I was involved in Yemen, which is now very much in the news. And so the Royal Navy friends of mine are a little bit anti. They can't understand why I've become a peace activist, but my American friends can, which is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Do you think that if we try to support peace amongst us, that we would live a safer world, we would live in a happier world?
Well, I think we would. I mean, there's no question about it, because as I always tell everyone, nobody ever wins a war. The winners don't win a war. I was born in the Blitz during World War II outside London. We saw German bombers overhead. We had a V-1 Doodlebug rocket come over and land in a field near us. I saw an American bomber crash in flames at our nearest airfield. And of course, Britain was supposedly one of the winners, but all the 50s and into the 60s was not easy living in England because of the results of war, rationing, etc. And so I don't think anybody wins war. And I cannot see why, personally, I don't want to get too political here, I cannot see why we're supplying all these weaponry to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine and Russia should not be our problem. It's not affecting a member of NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO and never should be a member of NATO. Of course, NATO has the ruling that if one member of NATO is attacked, then NATO should come to its rescue. But it's not. And on top of that, we've got so many problems at home, as you know, with everything that's going on here, the racism, the inflation, the cost of living, employment, etc. And so when we have a budget of $858 billion for the Pentagon, and that's just a budget, it's not including all the current spending on the wars, that a lot of that money could be used elsewhere at home and perhaps abroad, helping other countries rather than destroying them. That's really my feelings about it all.
So you're saying that we shouldn't be helping the Ukraine at all?
I personally, well, I mean, I know this is a difficult one because Putin is an extremely evil man, but he's extremely unstable. And when NATO was formed in 1949, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was designed to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was agreed, unfortunately not in a treaty, but that NATO would not expand further eastwards. And of course it has. There are 30 countries in NATO, and 7 of them are ex the Soviet bloc. So when you're dealing with a very dangerous man like Putin, who has, of course, got nuclear weapons, which is extremely scary, threatening him with the expansion of NATO and even talking about making Ukraine a member of NATO, to me was guaranteed to get him to do something really heinous and criminal, which is what he's doing. And he's not doing well. So the more we supply Ukraine, the more likelihood Putin is to use the nuclear weapons. Even a small tactical nuclear weapon, not a strategic nuclear weapon, can cause a nuclear winter, which can cause death and devastation all around the world with famine and drought. So I am not in any way a supporter of us sending these tanks as we are now doing, because I don't think tanks are really going to make a great deal of difference. The next thing we're going to do is use our air forces, which will be absolutely awful. I know only too well about the use of fighter pilots and bombers. And I'm a very ardent follower of the drone warfare that's going on. I'm one of the drone spokesperson for the Coalition for Peace Action. And so the situation is getting horribly out of control, but I don't really want to focus entirely on Ukraine because we're involved all over the world. We're doing stuff in West Africa that is not reported. We're in Somalia. Syria is still ongoing, as I say. So I just still have made this tremendous transition as to that peace is the only answer. And it's going to help everybody around the world, not just the US.
How do you think we can bring that about?
I think a lot of it is education. I really do. Most people have no clue what we're doing abroad. I mean, first of all, this is very perhaps cynical comment to make, but Americans' knowledge of geography is very poor. And when I was working in New York, I had a map of the world, which obviously had a map of Iraq on it. And this was before we invaded Iraq in the early 20s. And everybody in my office was saying, yeah, go and invade Iraq and kill Saddam and all this sort of stuff. And I said, well, to start with, do you know where Iraq is? And I asked 10 of them to come up one by one and put their finger on the map on Iraq. And not one of them could. And yet they wanted to bomb the hell out of the country. So if they didn't know where it was, they certainly didn't know anything about its creed and its culture. And of course, we had supported Saddam in his 8-year war with Iran, which is so ironical. We supplied him with weaponry. So some of it was chemical ordnance. So, yeah, as you can see, I'm really upset about the state of play in our foreign policy in terms of the military and the amount of spending that's going into it. It's 10 times more than the next 10 countries combined. It's quite incredible. And yes, I think we have to explain that. I mean, there are lots of very good organizations. There's the Massachusetts Peace Action, which is very good. Our one here is excellent, run by Reverend Bob Moore, as I say. And I think it's so important that people get to learn about what is happening around the world, nearly always led by the United States, unfortunately. And now, of course, we're threatening China over Taiwan. And quite frankly, why is that a problem for us? It was always agreed that there would be one China, that Taiwan would be part of China when it became Taiwan after being Formosa. And why are we involved? I mean, it's got nothing to do with us. I don't know. I think it's American exceptionalism attitude that we need to rule the world. And I think that's very unfortunate and could be is very dangerous and can be very suicidal for us down the road.
Well, do you think... what do you think that as a peace activist, you've done that as well for the past 20 years, you said. What sort of things do we need to do for communities and societies as peace activists? What would help people in that direction?
Well, it's a very difficult one because I think one has to explain what we're doing abroad to start with and make them realize that this is not working and it's not good for society and it's not good for the world. Obviously, I became a Quaker, and as you probably know, peace is at the forefront of Quakerism. People ask me to explain in words of one syllable about Quakerism, and the letters of the word spices is very important because it's S for simplicity, P for peace with the uppercase, I for integrity, C for community, E for equality, and S for stewardship of the land. And I don't think anybody can really question those qualities. Some people say, oh, my religion believes in that. And I always counter with, well, do you actually practice it? And so peace is very much at the forefront of the Quaker faith. An awful lot of conscience objectors were Quakers in both World War I and World War II and in Vietnam. I've got a friend who's the Quaker chaplain at Harvard University. And he spent 3 years in jail as a conscientious objector during Vietnam. I'm not sure you quite have to go that far and end up in jail to get your message across. But I think talking to people and getting them to understand is a great help. We do have wonderful functions at the Coalition for Peace Action. The annual Multi-Faith Service for Peace is always held in November in the Princeton University Chapel, followed by the annual conference where we always have wonderful peace activists and religious speakers. And so it's a long haul to get people to really take this seriously, as I think you're alluding to, Joan. And but I just wish more people would be thinking about it, because what we do abroad is not helping our cause, our life at home one bit. I mean, when you have 858 billion, and it's going to go up in the next year on the military alone, and as I say, that's just a budget. It means an awful lot of money that could be going into social welfare and various other noble causes that we should be taking very seriously in the States. The money's not going there.
As a peace activist, you've done volunteer work. What sort of things have you done, volunteer work, that helped people?
Well, it started off with this wonderful organization that's now called Plan International. And it started in the Spanish Civil War in 1937, when it was called Child Reach. And it was started by an English relief worker and an English journalist. And it was designed to help the poor orphan children as a result of the ghastly bombing by Francisco Franco's nationalist army and air force, supported by the fascists, particularly, I think, Italy. And that morphed into Foster Parents Plan, and now it's Plan International. And I got involved first with a boy in Mali, in West Africa, where you can remember his name, Yamadou Traoré, and a girl in Senegal, whose name was, I can't remember her name, but anyway. And I never, unfortunately, got there to be with them because it was just too complicated. It meant flying to Bamako, the capital of Mali, which, by the way, means city of crocodiles, and taking a motorized canoe up the Niger River to close to the Guinea border where Yamadou was. Her name was Ndai Mbombe, by the way. And then it was just too complicated. And what was fun, though, was our son, Rich, was at the same age as Yamadou, and they couldn't communicate, of course, in words, but they used to do pen pictures and paintings and send them to each other. And of course, in that country, they speak mostly Bambara, which is the local language, and some French, of course, because it was French Sudan originally. And then I moved on and took on a boy in Nepal, Nihe, but his village was overrun by Maoist guerrillas, so the whole program collapsed. And so I moved further closer to home, and that's when I took on Maybelline in El Salvador and Izela in Nicaragua. And I spent a lot of time down there, twice in El Salvador, helping in their schools, being with the family, and same in Nicaragua. And the kids all outgrew the program at 18, so I was constantly moving on. And then I took on a boy in Bolivia. And there's an interesting side story to that, because I was leading historical walking tours for about 15 years for the Historical Society of Princeton, until I had to give up because I've got this terrible back issue, which is unfortunately the long-term result of my ejection from a burning fighter aircraft, an F-4, into the Pacific during Vietnam. And nobody's found a cure for it. But I'm now doing tours in a small bus. But on one of the Sunday historical tours in Princeton, there was a couple from Bolivia. And they said, "Have you ever been to Bolivia?" This before the tour. And I said, "No, but I'm planning to go there because I sponsor a boy there who lives at 9,000 feet in the Andes outside La Paz." And they said, "Oh, that's interesting. We live in La Paz." And about 20 minutes later, they caught up with me again and said, "When you come to Bolivia, you're coming to stay with us." And I'd never met them until 20 minutes before. And eventually I booked flights, and they came back to Princeton. I think one of their sons was at the graduate school, I think. And they took me out for a drink and said, "Have you booked your flight to Bolivia?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Oh, we'll meet you at the airport." And I said, "Well, it gets in at 2:00 in the morning." And they said, "Oh, don't worry. All flights get in La Paz at 2:00 in the morning. We'll be there." Well, believe it or not, we were living in Denver for a period, outside Denver in the mountains. And I flew from Denver to Miami, and the plane went unserviceable in Miami. So I spent the night in Miami and arrived 24 hours late. Sure enough, there they were at the airport at 2 in the morning. So that was a great experience. And then now they've all outgrown the program. So I have a girl in Colombia, which I'd love to go to, Cartagena, which I believe, I'm not pronouncing it right, but is a beautiful old Spanish city. But then my wife and I decided to move on into a group called Cross-Cultural Solutions that sadly has not survived COVID. But with them, we taught school in the Peruvian Andes. Again, 9,000 feet always seems to be the height. A lovely old Spanish city called Ayacucho. And then we moved on to teaching in the Black townships outside Cape Town, which I could say was a sort of homecoming for me because I'd lived in Simonstown, not far from Cape Town, as a boy. And this was an absolutely wonderful experience, teaching kids who walked to school from the townships where they lived in shacks, one toilet for 50 families. They loved coming to school, the sweetest kids, aged from about 8 to 18, lovely kids. And then that led me to volunteer in the Syrian refugee camp in Greece, north of Athens. In fact, two of them, one called Ritsona, which was mostly Syrians, some Somalis, and another called Onafita, which was a lot of Iranians as well. Those were the overseas volunteer work to help people I've done. And then back home, I've been tutoring for many years at the Trenton Area Soup Kitchen in the adult education program, trying to help people get their high school diplomas who dropped out of school some many years ago, some of them in their 40s. And also at Homefront, doing the same thing, mostly teaching geography and English essay writing. Task has really not come back in terms of the education. There aren't many people coming in for education at Task, but I'm back at Homefront, doing it on Wednesdays, which is great. And on top of that, I'm now, and have been for about 18 months, volunteering with a wonderful refugee program called Interfaith Rise out of Highland Park, out of the Reform Church of Highland Park. And there, because of my back, I can't do too much standing and walking, but I'm doing a ton of driving, helping refugees get to appointments, get to doctors, take their driving tests. And these are refugees from Afghanistan, Guatemala, Honduras, Rwanda, Eritrea, Sudan, a whole bunch of them. Funny enough, not too many Ukrainians, because as I've learned, the Ukrainians are very united in this country with lots of relatives, as I think Joan knows only too well. And they're all looking after each other, and they don't really need much of this help. A lot of this funding has been coming from the State Department, but a lot of that's drying up. So they're always looking for donations, and of course, drivers are very important. And I get a tremendous thrill out of being with them all. They're all such nice people, particularly the Afghans. A lot of them are ex-army officers. A lot of them unfortunately had to leave most of their family behind in Afghanistan, and they're all very resolute and doing a wonderful job of trying to help themselves and to help, of course, their families abroad. So it's all very satisfying. It really is very rewarding for me, and I hope I'm doing some good.
Richard Moody, you're making such wonderful contributions. And what's so interesting is that you turned yourself around. You saw what mattered to you, and you said, let me put my energies and let me put my help where it will do the most good for what I believe in. Well, and that's why you're such an important person in our world.
Well, and that's very kind of you.
Thank you so much for doing what you're doing and for coming to us today to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. And let's hope that you come back again and have more good things to share with us.
All right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.